So we're going to have a first invited speaker now. So I just want to thank again everybody to come, that you guys came here. I would remind you this is a Auctions and Marketing Design section of Inform's sponsored event. So I would invite everybody to join and participate in all of our activities. So it's my great pleasure to have Fanyin Zheng being our first invited speaker. Fanyin is in the intersection of all of the expertise of the market design. She has a PhD from Economics in Harvard, and she works in a business school at Columbia in DRO area. And she made important contributions in market design, bringing up basically applied econometrics and into the mix. And she serves also as associate editor in the Management Science Journal Department of Marketplace Analytics that many of us in our community find as a top publication outlet. So it's a great pleasure to have Fanyin present here. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Thanks, Sasha, for the great introduction. And thank you also to the organizers, Itai, Sasha, and Alex, for organizing this great workshop and for having me as a speaker.
I'm going to switch your microphone.
Oh. Okay. And I'm very excited to be here. This is also my first in-person conference since the beginning of 2020, so thank you again for having me. Today I'm going to be talking about private versus pooled transportation, looking at customer preference and design of a green transport policy. This is a joint work with Kashish Arora, who was a PhD student when we started this project. He's now a faculty at the Indian School of Business, and also with Karan Girotra from Cornell. So the motivation of this paper is air pollution and traffic congestion in big cities. So sort of among the kind of big discussions of climate change, this is a very important topic. And here, there's a lot of evidence about how the transportation markets play an important role. So 16.5% of the greenhouse gas emissions, for example, in the US, come from passenger vehicles. Drivers on average could also spend a very long time per year in traffic in a lot of big cities, so it's economically very costly. And also, in the context of our study, which is in Delhi, in the developing world, 6.5% of Delhi's enormous amount of GHG emissions every year comes from idling vehicles alone. So a growing contributor of this problem in recent years is actually ride-hailing vehicles. So they are particularly bad for several reasons. One is that a larger fraction of the miles they travel are deadhead miles, meaning traveling without a passenger inside. Okay, partly because of that, their average GHG emission is 50% higher than a regular passenger car that's not in the ride-hailing business. So as a result of this, a lot of big cities have been also thinking about policies that target these ride-hailing vehicles on the road to reduce the number of these ride-hailing vehicles. So for example, New York City has been implementing several waves of congestion surcharge policies targeting Uber and Lyft vehicles in the city. So what are some kind of better alternatives here, greener alternatives? So pooled transportation is the alternative. Public transportation and shared cab ride services like Uber Share and so on are clear alternatives. But the growing kind of sector of this market has been the microtransit or shuttle services such as Ola, Via, Chariot, and so on. There's a lot of benefits of these microtransit. They reduce congestion and GHG emissions because we're now able to pack multiple passengers into one vehicle. But also, in a lot of cities, they are kind of replacing these underutilized public transportation, which has often have very badly designed routes and services, and also provide access to jobs in transit desert. Okay, so this is going to be the shuttle service is going to be the focus of our paper in terms of the pooled transportation option. So now an important question that we want to understand first is, are riders actually choosing between the private and pooled ride services? And if so, how much does the pooled ride service reduce private rides and their GHG emissions?
Switch your mic one more time. Sorry.
So we want to know this because we want to know, how policymakers should design their green transport policy so that they're effectively promoting the pooled ride services in big cities. So that's what we're going to do in this paper. So we're going to do it in two parts. So first, we want to understand riders' preferences from data. What are the important service features that affect riders' choices to begin with? This we actually know very little from the data. So although there's been a kind of explosion of papers on the ride-hailing industry, both empirically and also theoretically, of course, but some of these kind of basic information about riders' preferences, about the basic parameters of this market, actually we still don't know. So we want to understand the riders' value of time, for example, and detour, and so on. Okay, so how much do they care about the different service features of private and pooled ride services? Once we've done that, then we can use our estimated model to then empirically evaluate how effective different kinds of green transport policies are. So for example, we can look at the congestion surcharge policy that's been implemented in New York and a lot of other big cities, versus what we are going to focus more on in this paper is improving shuttle service features. Okay, so which ones are more effective, and what are their impact on the number of ride-hailing vehicles on the road, which is, from the policymaker's perspective, we want to bring down that number. So the context of our study is this company in India called Ola. So they operate cab services, but also shuttle services. Okay, so it's a great data set to kind of study some of these questions that we're interested in because it's a single platform that operates or provides both services. Okay, so if I'm taking a cab, then it's very simple. I want to go from A to B. I just go direct. But if I'm taking a shuttle, so here Ola offers a fixed route shuttle service. So if I'm going from A to B, so there might be some commute that I have to do to walk to the shuttle pickup or drop off station. And then the route that I'm traveling on is also likely to be longer in both the travel distance and travel time. So those are kind of inconveniences that the rider is going to occur to the rider. So how are we going to do this? So we're going to use Ola's cab and shuttle data in the Delhi region. So I want to first show you some descriptive evidence without any model of substitution patterns between cab and shuttle. So we want to know, is these pooled ride services an alternative for riders who would have taken a cab? And then I want to model as an estimate customer's choice of transportation. So I want to look at riders' preference parameters for important service features like their value of time, of detour, so longer distance and longer travel time on a pooled ride service compared to a private cab service. And also their commute. So this is the walking distance between my true origin or destination and where I get on or off the shuttle stop. There's some challenges in the estimation. So there's going to be a endogeneity issue. I'll tell you exactly what it means and why this is difficult to deal with in our particular setting. And we're going to be using some spatial network structure to construct instrumental variables to deal with these challenges. And also, we have to think a little bit about price setting of new services in this context and figure out the estimation. And then once we have the model estimated, we're going to then use it to conduct counterfactuals where we could calculate the writer's choices under different policy interventions. So for example, under congestion surcharge policies, how would writers choose between the two types of services? And of course, also some outside options, such as public transportation. And then we're going to compare that to, if we did other types of interventions. So for example, if we improved certain features of the shuttle service, so if we improve the design of shuttle route, how would riders choose between the two services? And then compare, how many ride-hailing vehicles we're going to be able to reduce under different types of policies. So just to kind of give you a preview of the findings. So what we find is first, an entry or introduction of shuttle route reduces cab rides by 3% per week in the city of Delhi in the sample period that we're looking at. So this is substantial amount of substitution or substantial amount of actually reduction of GHG emissions. So if we look at the total CO2 emissions, this go down per week by 490 tons. Okay, so is this a big number? I think it is. So if we think about a flight from New York to Denver, for example, I'm going to be able to fly 500 people between the two places using this, which would be equivalent to this 490 or 500 tons of CO2 emissions. And in terms of rider preferences, we find that the cost of waiting for a cab is similar to a mid to high income salary in Delhi at the time, which is about 12 rupees per minute, which is a good, very nice finding from estimating our model. And we find that shuttle riders value shorter commute much more than shorter detour. Okay, so people care about the walking distance a lot more than spending an extra minute on the shuttle. Once they are inside the vehicle, they care less about spending more time. And this also is very interesting because it's going to have implications in terms of the design, how to improve the design of the shuttle service. We also find that shuttle riders value shorter detour much more in the morning than in the evening, which is also intuitive, right? So we're looking at mostly commuters on these routes, and people care a lot more about kind of getting to work on time, and they're more flexible in the evening. And in terms of policy counterfactual, so using these estimation results, we're going to be able to evaluate different policy interventions. We find that a 20% of congestion surcharge leads to a 4% reduction of the number of Ola vehicles on the road. That's sort of our benchmark, as 20% congestion surcharge is kind of similar to what has been implemented in New York, in Manhattan. But more interestingly, what we find is that if we are able to reduce the commute or the walking distance for riders by 20%, we're going to be able to achieve 40% of the benefits from this very high congestion surcharge. Okay, so this says that thinking about improving the design of the pooled ride service might be a very effective way or very effective alternative to these pricing the congestion surcharge type of policies. And then you might think, well, is this kind of implementable in practice? So we actually go and kind of try to implement it and use our model to evaluate how this can be implemented. We show that this commute reduction can be very effectively implemented through adding shuttle stops on certain routes. Okay, so there's a very easy, almost costless way of implementing these interventions that we're proposing, which is to better design the shuttle routes. Okay, so just very quickly about the literature. So there's not a lot in the literature about estimating rider preferences of pooled ride services yet. The existing literature mostly on private, so ride-hailing, so Uber, private taxi kind of services. So what we're contributing to this literature is bringing in, understanding better riders' preferences in terms of using pooled ride services, using shuttle service. There's also a larger literature on traffic congestion management, environmental impact, but most of these are kind of on the theoretical or modeling side, and we're bringing an empirical perspective to this literature. As I said, there's very little empirical studies in the literature on pooled transportation, especially on understanding riders' preferences. The existing ones are more on using experimental designs to kind of try to look at how riders respond to discounts, to different kinds of monetary incentives. And more generally, we fit in this empirical studies of ride-hailing and taxi markets as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background and the data, and then show some descriptive evidence. And then I'll introduce a model and talk about the estimation, the results, and then I'll talk about the counterfactuals. By the way, please feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Yeah. So again, we're looking at Ola in India. This is the company that we collaborated with. The data comes from 2016. So this is, again, very nice setting to look at this problem because it's a single platform that offers both services, so both taxi, private cab, and shuttle service. So in the Delhi region at the time, Ola had 3.5 million users, so a very large market. In terms of the private cab service, so you can just think about it as Uber in India. And at the time, they are the biggest in that market, so 65% market share in the sample period. For shuttle, it was a new service at the time. They just started introducing these services, and they target mid to high income commuters. So a rider would book a seat in advance, and then the shuttle runs with a fixed route and schedule. Okay, so the rider could track the shuttle location in real time through the app, and the shuttle has AC, Wi-Fi, entertainment console, and so on. So this is really kind of very different from the public buses that are also, of course, available there. So this is how the app looks. If you open up, you can choose where you want to get on, where you want to get off, and then on the next page, you will be able to choose which exact time you want to be picked up, or which exact vehicle you want to be picked up and dropped off on that route. So the data we have, there are three kinds of parts of data that we're using. For cab data, we have 8 months of data where there are 3.5 million users, over 25 million rides. We know the customer ID, so we know if it's 2 different rides but taken by the same customer, we know that. We know the pickup and drop-off locations, and also price paid and distance traveled. We also have timestamps of trip request and also timestamp of pickup and drop-off. So we can figure out what is the waiting time, for example, for each ride. For shuttle data, we have the same sample period, 8 months of data. There we have 76,000 users, over 1 million rides. We know also customer ID, pickup and drop-off locations. We know the price paid and distance traveled. We also know the location of the mobile device when booking is requested. So we use this information to figure out the rider's work location and home location. We also know the time window of the trip, but we don't observe the exact pickup and drop-off time. And then we're also using Google API data to figure out locations of points of interest by category. So this is a large data set. We know, how many cafes are at each location and so on. And then we're using census tract level demographics data. So that's the data we have. So give you a sense of how the cab and shuttle rides data look like. So if we look at the price paid, on average, the cab rides are a lot more expensive than shuttle rides, of course. But if you look at distance traveled, the average is not so different. Shuttle rides are on average a little bit longer. And time traveled on average of these rides, they're also comparable, although for both, there's a kind of large variation. And then we also know, so the average wait time, for example, is really long, if we think of, at least by Manhattan standard, but that might be a bit of an outlier as well. But over 11 minutes, but this is largely due to the very bad traffic condition. So it's just a very congested city in Delhi on average. And then we also see the commute. So on average, riders walk 600 meters to go to their pickup or drop-off location. But again, there's large variation around the mean. So what are some descriptive evidence that we could see? How are riders using these two services? So first, we see that there are a substantial amount of users that use both cab and shuttle in the sample period. Okay, so this is not a segmented market where people who ride a cab would only use a cab, people who use shuttle would only use a shuttle. And then we also know two services are not complements, so we can see when these rides happen. And then there's close to zero of cab and shuttle rides that are taken within 30 minutes. So people are not riding the shuttle and then use the cab to travel the last mile, for example. And then finally, we can use the entry of new shuttle routes. So each time Ola introduces new shuttle routes, we can use that as a quasi-experiment to look at the clear substitution of rides and the rides between cab and shuttle. Okay? So does the number of cab rides go down after shuttle entry? And that we use a difference in differences analysis to look at. So for example, so skip the details, but just show you kind of what the result looks like. So if I look at, on average, a new entry of shuttle route, and I look at the number of cab rides, how that changed before and after. The entry of the shuttle, so this is what I get. So on average, per week, there's an 88 number of 88 cab rides reduction when a new shuttle route is introduced. Okay, so this is the amount of people that switched potentially from using a cab to using the shuttle service. Okay, this amounts to this is how we get the 490 tons of CO2 emissions in terms of the reduction from using the cab to using the shuttle. Okay, so there's a substantial amount of substitution between the two services, and this is a meaningful number in terms of environmental impact is what we find. Okay. So let me next introduce the model. So for customer I who wants to travel from origin J to destination K at time T, they're going to choose one of the three options. So they could either take a shuttle, they could take a cab, or there's some outside option. So this can be public transportation, it could be their driving, it could be auto rickshaws. That's also a popular option in Delhi. So the utility that customer I gets from choosing alternative A at time T is going to look like the following. So UIJKTA is going to be the utility function. It depends on a few things here. So first, I have alpha A, which is an option or alternative specific intercept. Okay? It captures the average utility of shuttle or cab or the outside option. And then this utility depends on a few factors. So first I have PJKA, which is the price of that alternative on this route to JK. And then wait time, so WJA is the waiting time for cab. For shuttle, we don't observe the wait time, but they do have a fixed schedule. In the event that they run late, the average wait time is going to be captured by this alpha. If there's a variation in how long the wait times are across different routes, then it's going to be captured by the unobserved term. I'll explain this in a little bit. And then I have two factors here, XJKA1. They are route service specific characteristics. So for example, the travel time, commute to the shuttle stop, travel distance, and also we include frequency, how frequent the shuttle service is provided. And then the second one, XJK2, these are route-specific characteristics, so only JK specific. So these are Google API characteristics and demographics at J and K, and also their interactions. So how many office buildings there are, for example, at location J, at location K, what's the population density there, and also their interactions. So there's a rich set of both route service characteristics and route characteristics. And then I have QIT, which is rider I's total number of rides in the past week. So this gives me an idea of how much the rider uses the service or how familiar they are with the platform on average. And then I have these CJKA, which are unobserved. So these are route service specific unobserved characteristics. So this is important to include because as empirical researcher, we never have the data that's exactly the information that the riders have or maybe not even what the platform has. So I want to allow for some unobservables here. And so this can capture unobserved route service popularity. So for certain routes, maybe one service is particularly popular. Or you could also capture traffic conditions, which are also could be route and service specific. Here, because I'm allowing for these unobservables, kind of one important reason that I want to do this is to allow these unobservables to be correlated with some of the observables. Okay, so that's important. Because if I think about the price, for example, the platform is probably pricing different routes depending on some of these unobserved features about the route that I have no idea about. Okay? So allowing this correlation is going to be very important because it affects how I'm going to go and estimate this model and affects a lot also the estimation result. Okay, so allowing CJKA to be correlated with price, wait time, and travel time is going to be important, and this is what we call the endogeneity issue in the estimation problem. And I'll talk about how we deal with that in a little bit. So finally, there's an outside option, and the utility is normalized to 0. And in the estimation, we can also allow all the parameters to depend on rider I's type, which can be unobserved, and also JK distance, so how long the ride is. Okay, so if I take this model, and then I go and calculate, I should say, forgot to say, the epsilon IJKTAs are IID idiosyncratic type 1 extreme value distributed errors, like standard MNL models. So then, for customer I who wants to travel from J to K at time t, they're going to choose one of the services, A, with the probability PJKTA, which looks like this, the familiar MNL type of choice model. So this is going to be kind of very easy to estimate. So I could just simply take these choice probabilities. I know the exact functional form. I can take them to data if I didn't have these endogeneity issues. So the CJKAs, if they are observed or if they are not correlated with any of the observables. Okay, so this can be very easily estimated. But the difficulty is that because of endogeneity, I cannot just do that. Or if I did that, I would end up with very biased estimates. Okay? So what do we do with that? Well, we need to find instrumental variables for these endogenous observables, so price, wait time, travel time, and so on, to allow for the correlation or take into account the correlation of them, between them, and see the unobservable so that I could get unbiased estimates. Okay? So we're going to do that through an instrumental variable and control function approach. Okay? So in the estimation, we're going to focus on shuttles operating hours, so between 5 a.m., 8 p.m. On weekdays, and also separating the morning and evening estimation. So we allow the parameter values to take on different values for the morning and for the evening rush hours. So we're going to use the control function, the maximum likelihood, to estimate our nonlinear model. And the instrumental variables, we're going to need those for price, for wait time, and for travel time. So just as a preview, how we're going to construct these instruments is going to be through exploiting the route network structure in the data. And in theory, we're going to have actually a very large potentially valid set of instrumental variables. And here we're going to need some selection procedure to select the most relevant ones. And we're going to do this using some machine learning method. And interesting kind of phenomenon in this estimation is that the price setting of cab and shuttle services by the platform could be actually very different if you think about it. So the platform may be maximizing profit, or it might be trying to grow customer base, like a lot of new services or new companies might be doing in this market. So this would mean that there could be higher or lower prices for routes with higher unobserved utility. Okay? And we actually find a difference between the cab, which is a more mature service for Ola, and the shuttle, which is a new service of Ola. And then we actually see different types of endogeneities there. All right. So there's a challenge in finding good instrumental variables in this setting. In standard choice model or customer demand estimation, we might utilize products that are offered differently across different markets and use the variation there to construct instrumental variables. Or we might try to find cost shifters to construct IVs, but this is very difficult in both cases in our setting. So, and moreover, our markets are also spatially correlated, right? The locations are not independent; they're all connected by these rides or these routes. And so, what we're going to do is to exploit route network structure and the rich information on location characteristics. So, at the high level, the idea is that we want to choose some exogenous but neighboring locations and use the characteristics of those locations as instrumental variables. Okay, I'll explain a little bit on the next slide. And then we want to select the most relevant ones using data instead of handpicking. There we're going to use, there's some recent work done in econometrics where we could use lasso to select IVs, but still in the second stage of the estimation, correct for the inference, so we have the correct standard errors there. So let me kind of tell you a little bit more how we do this. So if I look at a route, so from location J to K, so the rider is traveling on this route, UIJKTA is a utility that the rider gets. And so I'm looking at endogenous variables here, so the price on this route or wait time on this route and so on. So how do I find valid instruments here? So I'm going to look at another location H, for example, and I want H to be connected on to J in my network. So this just means that there's traffic going between, so there are rides that happen between these two nodes. So that the characteristics of location J is actually going to be relevant for the utility here, because, for example, if this is a very attractive origin location, there might be a lot of people traveling from H to J, and then the supply of drivers at location J would be higher, right? So then the wait time here would also vary, okay? I want to look for location H that are connected with location J, but on the other hand, I want location H to be far away enough from location K, so there's almost no one traveling between these two locations. And the reason is that I want the characteristics of location H to be uncorrelated with any observables at JK, conditional on the characteristics of location J. Okay, so that's the idea. This is how I'm satisfying the two conditions for an instrumental variable to be valid. So it has to be relevant, so it's correlated with price or wait time for this route JK, but then at the same time, uncorrelated with the unobservables on this route JK, so CJKA. So there are a lot of options if I think about that. Any characteristics at location H, once I find these location H, so there could be also many of these location H. Any of the characteristics there could be used as a IV. Any of the interactions of the characteristics, so for example, population density interacted with number of office buildings, these can also be used as IVs. So there's a large set of potentially valid IVs, and then we use lasso to do the selection here. Okay, I'll show you how the results look like in the next section. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. There are such locations. So you could define sort of the distance here. So you would have some benchmark in terms of distance. For example, if it's more than X miles or X kilometers, you can select those ages. But of course, the distance, what you use as the benchmark could also vary, right? You can allow this to be very, very far or just far. And that's also one of the reasons that you might end up with a larger set of IVs. But the good thing is you can always go to your data and verify. So are there actually people traveling between these 2 points, right? Great. Okay, and then going back to the price setting of cab and shuttle. So cab price is going to be determined by observables like travel distance and time, route characteristics, and of course there could be unobserved factors, as I said before. So we don't observe surge multipliers, for example, in the data. We also don't observe vehicle type, so in terms of premium or regular vehicle. And then there's also route popularity that we don't observe. Shuttle price is sort of similarly determined. There are observables and unobservables. So here, there's no surge pricing for shuttle service, but there could also be unobserved route popularity that we want to take into account. So platform's objective here in price setting, so they could be maximizing revenue or profits. So in this case, price is likely to be positively correlated with these unobserved popularity factors of the route, right? So I want to price those routes that are more popular with a higher price. Okay, that's how I'm going to maximize my revenue or profits. But on the other hand, if I'm trying to grow my customer base for a new service, I might actually price those more popular routes with a lower price, okay, in order to grow, to attract more customers to my platform, to this new service. So the bias in the price coefficient may actually have either direction. Okay, and I'll show you the results in our setting. It actually differs for shuttle and for cab. So let me show you the results. Okay. So first, I have the estimation result without IV. So this is the second column here. And then I have the estimation result with IV. So first, you can see that for price, for example, there's a big difference in terms of the coefficient when I do take into account endogeneity instrument for prices versus if I don't. Okay, the magnitude of the coefficient is very different. So this says, using instruments here is actually very important. Otherwise, I might get actually very biased estimation result, and then, of course, very biased counterfactual result. And then if I look at, so here I'm also showing you the coefficient of the control function, which precisely tells me how price is correlated with the unobserved C term. And for shuttle price, this is a negative coefficient. So this means that Ola is actually pricing the more popular routes with a lower price. Okay? But for cab, this is positive. It says that Ola is pricing the more popular routes with a higher price. So the first one is consistent with sort of they're attracting customers. Shuttle is a new service, and they're trying to grow their customer base. And that is consistent with the coefficient of the control function we have here. And then for cab price, this is more consistent with a profit or revenue maximization objective. And cab is a more mature service for Ola, and this also makes sense. It's an intuitive result. And then I have, I should also say, for waiting time and travel time, there's also significant results. I'll interpret sort of the magnitude of these results on the next slide. So here I'm also showing you the result of lasso selection. Indeed, actually, a lot of these IVs that we selected using lasso, so essentially letting data to tell us which IVs, which instrumental variables are more relevant. A lot of them are actually interactions, and there's also quite some differences across these different endogenous variables, which, ex ante, we won't be able to figure out ourselves. Okay, and so this is actually our main result, where we separate morning and evening rush hours. And so 2 things I want to point out here. If we look at commute, so this, again, is walking distance between the stops and the true origin or destination of the rider. I have a negative and significant coefficient, so riders hate longer commute, longer walking distance, which is intuitive. But the more interesting thing is that they hate it more in the morning than in the evening. Okay? And if I look at travel distance, I have similar patterns between the 2 time windows, and also have a negative coefficient. So the longer the travel distance is, the less likely that the rider is going to choose that service, conditional on the market they're in, the true origin and destination they want to travel from and to. And so they don't like detours. So how do I kind of interpret these results? So I can convert them into monetary values and compare them across different time windows, across different service features. So I find that 1 minute of waiting for cab is worth about 12.2 Indian rupees on average. So this is the interpretation of the waiting coefficient, the waiting time coefficient. 1 minute walking to shuttle stop is worth 7.5 rupees on average. So this is a much smaller number. And then I can look at the combined effect of travel time and travel distance. This gives me how much they dislike detours, okay, on the shuttle. And so I find that an extra minute of shuttle detour is worth 5.9 rupees on average. Okay, so what do we learn from here? So we learned that for shuttle service, riders care a lot more, 30% more about the shorter commute than shorter detour. Okay? So they really don't like when they have to walk a long distance to the pickup or drop-off stop. However, once they're in the vehicle, staying longer is much less of an issue for them. Okay, so that's interesting result and has important policy implications in terms of the design of these services. And then finally, if we compare the average software engineer, which is kind of a good targeting population's salary, to this is what we find in the model estimation result, we find that this is kind of equivalent to 12 to 15 rupees per minute in 2016, which is very similar to the ballpark of the results, the numbers that we find here. Okay. All right. So what do we do with these results, the estimated model? So first, we go and take the congestion surcharge policy. That's kind of our benchmark that's been implemented in a lot of cities, including New York. And we look at how much could this policy reduce the number of OLA vehicles on the road. So how many of ride-hailing vehicles can we actually reduce if we implemented a congestion surcharge policy? So we apply this per vehicle percentage surcharge in our model. And then we calculate riders' choices and number of riders switching from taking the cab to the shuttle, assuming that there's 100% pass-through to riders. So this is a big assumption. But in the paper, we actually relax this and allow supply-side response. In the end, we don't find a big difference in the numbers that we find in the end. So we're using this kind of simpler version of the model as the main specification. So what we find is that if you look at 20% of congestion surcharge, which is similar to the level implemented in New York, the number of OLA vehicle reduction due to switching from riders taking the cab to the shuttle is about 4%. Okay, so that's sort of our benchmark. This is a policy that's been adopted, that's been implemented by policymakers in big cities. And this is kind of the estimated effect of those policies. Now, what we're trying to say in this paper is that this is not the only policy, of course, one should consider. And more importantly, now, if we have this estimated model of how customers choose between two services, we know how much they care about each of these important service features, we can think about alternative policies that could be also effective. So we look at reducing commute, given that the disutility associated with commute is much higher than the disutility associated with longer detour for the pooled ride for shuttle service. So we look at if we reduce the commute, how much could we reduce the number of, how much could we incentivize riders to take shuttle instead of taking cab, and how much does that reduce the number of OLA vehicles on the road? So we evaluate this with our model and find that, so here if I reduce the commute by 5% to 20%, this is a corresponding number of OLA vehicle reductions that we're able to achieve. And if we could reduce 20%, then this could achieve 40% of the benefits of the congestion surcharge policy, okay, which is substantial. So if we could implement this in practice with relatively low cost, then this is definitely worth considering from the policymaker's perspective, okay? So now the question is, how do we implement that? So what we look at is what happened if we try to reduce a commute by adding stops on certain routes for the shuttle service. So to kind of give you an idea, so we have this one route here, and then we try to add stops towards kind of one end of this route. And then we go and evaluate how riders would choose between the two services under this counterfactual scenario and the resulting number of OLA vehicles on the road. So what we find is that adding 1 to 5 stops on some of these routes could reduce the number of OLA vehicles by 0.2% to 1.7%. Okay, so this says that adding 5 stops on certain routes could achieve as much as 40% of the benefits of this very high congestion surcharges that's been implemented in New York. So improving the design of certain service features of the shuttle service could actually help us incentivize more riders to switch from taking the private cab service to taking the shuttle rides. And this has substantial impact on reducing number of ride-hailing vehicles on the road and, of course, then their GHG emissions. So improving design of shuttle routes is effective in promoting shuttle ridership is the main takeaway here. So let me kind of conclude. So what we did in this paper is we used OLA's cab and shuttle data to study commuters or riders' preferences in choosing between the pooled and the private transportation. So what we find is that OLA shuttle provides commuters with an important alternative to private cab rides. And we show that we could use these data to estimate rider preferences for some of the key service features in this market. So riders value shorter commute much more than shorter detour for shuttle service. And they also value shorter commute and shorter travel distance more in the morning than in their evening commute. So I want to say these are pretty basic or fundamental preferences of riders in this market, but it hasn't been actually looked at in this literature. And I do think that there could be a lot of interesting future directions in the design of green transport policy and the design of transportation market. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you all very much. Yes, Martin. Oh.
Well, thank you very much. So this is an awesome project. I have a technical question and a more general maybe policy question. So on a technical level, it seems that these instrument variables, as you showed, play a big role, and you use lasso to select among the many. So I was wondering how robust this is. I mean, also in lasso, you can play around with the weights for the penalty term. You can use ridge regression or some other type of selection. So if instrument variables are so important, how robust are they? Are the results against different forms of variable selection? And more on a policy basis, so I think the ultimate goal is to reduce congestion, right? And you've analyzed these congestion charges that they use in New York, and you focus pretty much on on reducing these individual rights in a way. But there is more to reducing congestion, right? First of all, there are different congestion pricing policies. So like in Singapore, they use dynamic pricing, and that might have a huge impact. And you might target not only the ride-hailing drivers, but the entire population, and kind of reduce the leisure rides in times of congestion and so on and so forth. So isn't there a bigger picture rather than just reducing the ride-hailing vehicles? Because the ultimate goal is reduce congestion overall, right?
Yeah, great question. So first on the lasso selection for the IVs, so there's actually at least two kind of well-known papers in the econometrics literature that specifically study how we could use these methods to do IV selection. So here the question is, of course, how do I choose a tuning parameter is a big question. But also, once I've selected these IVs, I cannot kind of pretend that I didn't do the selection and I just knew that these are the best IVs and then go on and do my estimation like usual. I could give you the references if you're interested in. So essentially is this, oh, my slides are not, is Bologna and co-authors have looked at this extensively and provided actually nice packages for applied researchers to use here. So yeah, there are a lot of kind of nitty-gritties in it, I would say. And yes, you're exactly right that the robustness is important here. But I would say perhaps more importantly, getting the right inference, making sure that we have the right inference in the final stage of the estimation is also important here. So there's quite a bit of kind of technical work that needs to go in there. And yes, and on the congestion policy, so I completely agree. So here we could only look at the impact on ride-hailing vehicles or to be kind of exact number of OLA vehicles on the road. Although we are comfortable with just calling it the majority of at least ride-hailing vehicles, given OLA is the biggest player in the market at the time, more than 60% of the market share. But, and we focus on that mainly because they are kind of particularly bad in terms of GHG emissions and kind of contributing to the congestion problem in the sense that they drive around without anyone inside. But of course, there's a bigger question of the overall congestion, and for that, we tried to do a little bit in some of the robustness analysis in the paper, but we couldn't actually find big enough effect just because this is not, at least in Delhi, they are not kind of, they're still just a small part of the overall market. And so we couldn't say, yeah, of course there's the bigger question of the overall congestion, but we cannot say more in this paper. Okay.
Great. So one thing you can think of beyond vehicle reduction is the welfare of the riders in the system. And so I was wondering if there was a way to get at those types of questions with your model. So like as one example, the counterfactual you looked at as far as increasing number of stops, but decreasing commute time, that has some externalities on everyone who's riding. So I was wondering if there is a way to take what you've done and say anything about overall welfare, or if it's more targeted directly to this vehicle.
Yeah, no, I think we could. We could actually do a welfare calculation. We just thought that here, because there's going to be that dead weight loss, if we think about the tax policy, there's kind of a clear, the alternative is, of improving service feature is clearly much better. So we didn't do this calculation, but I think kind of related to that is also we don't want to kind of take a stance on what the outside option is exactly and how much people are switching kind of from these ride-hailing vehicles or shuttles to and from and to the outside option. So we just focused on the number of ride-hailing vehicles, so OLA vehicles, to kind of be able to say, here we can provide a precise number. But I agree that it will be interesting to also look at the overall welfare.